Good morning. I hope everybody is having a grand day today. I'm trying to make sure that I get the live shared out to as many people as possible. I hope everybody is doing well. I'm probably going to do my nails while we do this because it keeps my brain distracted and because they're driving me insane. So you're aware. And today we're going to talk some about Homo erectus and paleoanthropology and the other species that we lived alongside of and the species that came before us. This is one of those things that I talk about frequently in here. We have been focused for the last week or so on European heritage and European ancestry, specifically for reconnection purposes for people. But we do focus a lot on paleoanthropology in here, which is one of my areas of focus. So we're going to go ahead and do that again today and kind of bring that back around. I'm also, like I said, I'm probably going to be doing my nails while we do it. So we'll have a couple of things going on while it's happening. I have been, it's been pretty hard for me lately. I've been kind of back and forth about things that I want to really focus on. Hello, Abra. I really want to do some stuff on what's going on in the Middle East. And yet I don't want to end up with a banana because of it. And I know that there's a lot of issue going on right now. And so I've been kind of back and forth on how I want to approach things. So we'll probably be doing some focus on that as well over the next couple of weeks, next couple of days. If you're unaware, the ceasefire has not ceased any fire. People are still firing. And there is a lot of problems with the supposed release of hostages on both sides. We don't seem to see that Israel, we don't see in the mainstream that Israel's had hostages for 20-something years, and some of them are being released finally. And that's part of kind of what was asked is the negotiation was that some of the hostages that have been held hostage for a long time get released. So they're kind of going and attacking people as they're releasing their family members, going into people's homes and stealing from them. And so there's a lot of trauma going on right now, even in the midst of this supposed ceasefire. But I'm having a really hard time how I want to approach it and how I want to deal with it. And so as I'm trying to figure that out, we're just kind of working, I'm kind of working through how to approach it and to deal with it, to be honest. And to make sure that the way I approach it and to deal with it is as positive as possible for everybody involved. And so we might switch over to that over the next couple of days. Yeah, well, and not just that, but like we don't hear in the news and the mainstream frequently that Israel actually has hostages, right? Like that the hostage negotiation wasn't a one-sided hostage release. Like it was the fact that Israel is actually holding hostages. I mean, they released a kid that had been in prison since he was 19 years old. So for 20 fucking years, because he was in his 30s. There doesn't seem to be this understanding that there's a lot more going on over there. And so, but I need to approach it in the best possible way. Like it needs to be something that I handle in the best possible way. And so I'm trying to figure out how to handle it in the best possible way, right? So we're going to focus on some other things first. And then we will probably see where this becomes a topic of conversation over the next couple of weeks, just because it's an extremely important factor in what's going on in our world today. So as we're kind of sitting here today and talking about, paleoanthropology and who we are before and what we have done and what we have been, I think it's important that we also, have some space and some understanding for some of the traumas that are going on around the world, right? And taking care to ensure that that space for the traumas that are going on around the world is held and brought forward, right? And so I'm trying to, like I said, I'm just trying to do things in the best possible way. I don't want to, I don't want to contribute to negativity. I'd rather to contribute to positivity, right? So with that said, we're going to focus today on Homo erectus and on some of the stuff that is, paleoanthropological that we should be dealing with, or we should be looking at when it comes to uh, just the things that are going on all across the world. And if you are not new to my space, you know that we've had these conversations before and we've had this discussion before, right? And we've talked about how these things work and how these things are going before. Um, so for many, it will be kind of a more of a refresher than anything else. Though I'm sure that there will be people for who it's new. We talk a lot about, how there's not really a presence of violence, prior to 10,000 years ago in any human species, and what that means. And so we'll be touching on that a little bit today. And we'll also be touching a little bit today on, early science, the debunction of race, and the ways that we see that these problems that we're currently dealing with today are coming about. I'm not, so there is a conversation to be had around the fact that the man from Africa who was a king supposedly had a ship of 300 people, and he departed from West Africa and crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the 1300s. Um, so there is no, like Africans never visited. I think that there's a possibility that Africans visited, just like we know that Europeans visited before Columbus. But people who were phenotypically African are not who was found by the Europeans when they got here, I think is the thing that people want that distinguishing factor to be seen in. So if the predecessor of Mansa Musa, and I can't remember his name at the top of my head, actually made it across the ocean with 300 people in his ship, that would not have equated the 1 million people found here 100 years later. Um, that might have contributed to, some of the genetics in the area, though there's no evidence of it. And there's actually no evidence of the idea that this king left Africa. There is some statements of, or not that he left, but that he made it to Turtle Island, to Abiyala. There is statements that he left and sailed east with 300 people, but there's no statements that show that he was actually here. And there's no statements that show that the people that were found when Columbus arrived were in any way phenotypically African. So I'm not going to state that, we weren't capable of crossing oceans and we weren't capable of just going across the world. I am going to state that Turtle Island Indigenous people were phenotypically Turtle Island Indigenous, and Abiyalian Indigenous people were phenotypically Abiyalian Indigenous, and that the DNA supports that they had separated from the rest of Europe and Africa, maybe not Australia, but Europe and Africa by 54,000 years ago. So their adaptation to space was as complete as the European adaptation to space. In fact, you'll see that there's a more genetic similarity between Africans and Europeans than there is between Africans and Turtle Island Indigenous people. So is there, thought process that people could have made it over here and visited or learned about the culture or interacted with the people that were already here? Absolutely. I'm not going to, you know, we have been more mobile than we've always thought, and we've always been, able to cross water since Homo erectus. So is there evidence that, or not evidence, but thought process that people could have, visited here? Yes. That wouldn't mean though that the people who the Europeans found when they started invading were what we would think of today as phenotypically Black. And the people within the United States, within the Western Hemisphere, who are currently phenotypically Black are phenotypically Black because they have some descendancy from the African slave trade. Now, for me, that's an extremely important distinction for a couple of reasons. One of those is because if we take away the fact that this slave trade happened, if we take away the fact that the Middle Passage happened, if we take away the fact that the transatlantic slave trade happened, we are removing the atrocity that Europeans committed, and we are giving them a free pass, as well as ignoring some of the beautiful power and resilience that many of our ancestors had. My grandmother came over on the Middle Passage, and she experienced chattel slavery, and she escaped chattel slavery when she was pregnant with her master's child. And that to me is an extremely important thought process to acknowledge and to honor the strength that she had, the resilience that she had, the heroism that she had to do that, right? The strength and resilience and heroism of her family who had come over and have been harmed, and their ability to make it through for them to get to me. So I don't like the idea of ignoring that knowledge. I don't like the idea of, trying to give a free pass to the Europeans' atrocity. Um, so, yes, of course, we've always moved much more than we want to think we have, because we like to think that we're somehow far advanced today. And yes, we've always had some interaction. And yes, Africa was brilliant on so many levels in so many places. And there's a possibility that they could have in the 1300s made it over here via a ship. They are not the ancestors, though, of the people who are phenotypically Black here in Turtle Island today. That does not mean that there are not people who are phenotypically Black here in Turtle Island who do not have Indigenous Turtle Island ancestry as well. Afro-Indigenous is a huge thing. There are many people who are Afro-Indigenous, and that should be respected and understood. um, there's a unique trauma from being Afro-Indigenous. There's a unique trauma from having those two issues, or not issues, but those two heritages that have caused white people to take issue, would be a better way to put that. There is a unique experience from coming in both sides, right? I know many people who are Afro-Indigenous who, they have this experience of knowing one of their sides of history and going back really far and understanding their connection on one side, and on the other side being completely disconnected because that connection was stolen from them, right? Um, and so we should not, equate Afro-Indigenous as being somebody who is trying to erase Turtle Island indigeneity. um, yeah, we should also understand that, Turtle Island indigeneity was not phenotypically Black, that there are people who are phenotypically Black who have both or have both African and Turtle Island indigenous heritage, absolutely. But Turtle Island indigenous people, when the Europeans arrived, were not phenotypically Black. Um, I think that that's my biggest issue, actually, is that when we are dealing with stuff like that, or we're talking, or where we have people who have decided that Turtle Island Indigenous people that are phenotypically Turtle Island Indigenous are not actually the Indigenous people of this area, then we're erasing whole cultures. Well, we are giving a pass to Europeans for atrocity. Well, we are erasing the brilliant strength and resilience and power of many of the men and women and children who were brought over here and were stolen from their homes, right? There's a reason where we talk about stolen land and stolen people, right? The land was stolen from one group of people who faced a genocide, and the land was built, the country is built on the blood of another group of people who were stolen from their ancestors, stolen from their land, stolen from their homes, stolen from what's important to us. Indigenous people across the globe, land is important to them, right? Um, and it's not that the land belongs to them, it is that we belong to land. And when we belong to land, there is something powerful about belonging to the land, and something powerful about being in the land that you belong to. There is, this interaction of our bodies with the land that we belong to. And there is an interaction with our ancestry that we know today scientifically as epigenetics, right? And to have those things stolen from us and still be able to be resilient and still be able to, live through and actually work through it, I think is an extremely important acknowledgement, right? To not acknowledge that, to decide it's something else, really does a disservice to ancestry, does a disservice to who we are, and does a disservice to those of us who have ancestry who had to go through it, right? As a disservice to our ancestors, not necessarily to us specifically, but to our ancestors. And that for me is problematic. But of course, I mean, we know that Africans, people from North Africa, people from, West Africa, people all over Africa have made it across the globe. In the 1300s, in the 1400s, like there's a lot of interaction and movement. The idea that, the people who actually still had medicine and science were actually somehow the backwards people is really disgusting and weird, right? Like most of Africa still had medicine and science, where most of Europe had ignored medicine and science because of their God. And so, to think that the people who are still dealing with having medicine and science, having that understanding of the world, having that understanding of, the biome, to think that they didn't have the capability to, move is weird too, right? So I absolutely think that there's a possibility that people from Africa were able to make it over here and to visit, and maybe even stay for a little while and become a part of the cultures that were already here, because that's what immigration is, right? um, is absolutely possible. I don't think, though, that that means that the people that Columbus found when he landed on the Tano were phenotypically black. And state that I don't think that very much because of the fact that Columbus didn't describe them as phenotypically black. In fact, he described them as not being phenotypically black. He described them as being dark of skin with extremely coarse, straight hair, and that they were phenotypically more of a match for the Canary Islands than they were a match for Africa, that they were more a match for the South Pacific or down near India than they were a match for people from Africa in their descriptors, or in the way that they looked. So I, I wouldn't negate the possibility. I would just state that it does not mean that the people that were found here were, that recently from Africa. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that as people are moving across the globe and people are adapting to space, people are in other space for a long period of time before they reach to the space that they're at now. So everybody outside of Africa was in the Levant area, for like 100,000 years before the 50,000 years ago. And then when we look at, Australians, actually came in contact with a couple other species, and they're like 70,000 years there. And then when we look at Abiyala and Turtle Island, we see that they spent like 10,000 years among the Denisovans, probably in Australia and the islands of the South Pacific, according to the DNA and everything else. And that in that 10,000 years outside of Africa before they make it to Turtle Island, that means that they had already done a significant amount of changing in the way, in everything, in their culture and their knowledge and everything before they make it to Turtle Island. So to, say that they're descendant from tribes that exist in Africa today would be a misnomer, right? They're not even descendant of people who exist in Asia today, right? They're not even descendant of people who exist in Australia today, right? They're descendants of people who existed in Turtle Island 50,000 years ago, who moved across the globe to get there, not people who, stayed behind, not groups that stayed behind. And that actually makes total sense when you think about genetics, right? Like, how can you be a descendant of somebody who was never in the space that you're in, right? If they are, we kind of think that everybody is like descendant of Adam and Eve still, even though we have this knowledge that the Bible is not correct. We still have this idea that everybody is somehow descendant from Adam and Eve, or a single pair. But when we look at all the origin stories across the globe, always mention that there's other people involved, right? Even the origin stories within Africa talk about how that there were other people involved when they came about, right? Which would be the Homo, the other Homo species within Africa, as well as like Homo Neanderthal and stuff like that. So if we're looking at the fact that there's other species across the planet in all the origin stories, it tells us that there's some interaction there. And then if we look at the fact that like the mitochondrial lines, we see that the mitochondrial lines that are still within Africa aren't the parental mitochondrial lines of those who are out of Africa, right? That the way mitochondrial and Y DNA works, there's mitochondrial eaves are multiples. And you can have 10 daughters, and each one of your 10 daughters is going to have a different mitochondrial DNA that they pass on to their children because you've passed on a different mitochondrial DNA to each one of your 10 daughters. So, say you have 10 daughters and their mitochondrial DNAs are completely unique, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, right? And um, H, I, and J, leave. They're not descendants of A, B, and C. They might be descendants of one, but they're not descendants of A, B, and C, right? So if A, B, and C stay and H, I, and J leave, they might be related, but they're not descendants. And the unique DNA of H, I, and J means that the DNA and the mitochondrial DNA that's unique there is a new mitochondrial Eve, and it's a new foundation, right? And so it's a completely different foundation from their siblings' foundation. So the idea that those somehow equal a descendancy from other groups is a little bit, it's a little bit more biblical than scientific, right? It's a little bit more of our idea of a biblical life than it is of our understanding of what science is. And so I think that that's one of the things that has to be understood and looked at, because a lot of people don't want to understand that things aren't biblical in science, right? That's just not how it works in science. Science isn't a biblical thing, right? So um, that's how I think on that one. Um, so starting it out in Homo erectus, I know that there are people here in the group. We're pretty low right now. And so pretty much everybody here in the group probably is somebody who has been here before and heard this before. So if you want, we can change this up into something else so that we're not focusing on something that people have already learned before, so that we're not focusing on something that might not pique your interest because you've got that one. So if you want, we can work on more of the European ancestry, or we can work on a better understanding of what is going on overseas. Um, ooh, I don't know enough about genes. I'll be real with that one. Like, I know a little bit about like how DNA translates, but I don't know how. I'm not. Again, DNA doesn't syllable right for me because it's like H1B2. It doesn't work in my brain in the way that it should for me to be able to remember what it does, which is why I don't really do genetics and stuff, because I mean, I can teach you how to find things in your DNA kind of sort of, but I can't look at it and go, okay, I understand what this is, and I don't really remember what a lot of genes are really. Um, so Uh, I'm not really sure on that, unfortunately. We can have a conversation about, well, we can just have a conversation about whatever you guys want to, really, honestly. We can focus on whatever area that you want to. I know that currently it looks like there's a lot of people who probably are. We did find a new ghost species recently, actually. I haven't figured out yet whether or not that new ghost species is within our DNA or if it's within the other hominins' DNA, right? So, like we have currently, we had six, and the six that we had, one of them was within the DNA of Homo Neanderthal and Homo Denisovan, not within our DNA. So, I don't know if the seventh that they just found is within Homo Neanderthal or Denisovan, or if it's within our DNA. But we did just find a seventh ghost species. We are finding more ghost species as we're finding more species. We did just find, of course, that seventh species itself, the HLD6, that was found in China at 300,000 years ago, that actually looks a lot like Homo sapien. Like they're kind of a mix between Homo sapien and Homo erectus. They have the flat face and we do, and they have the start of a chin like ours. And they are looking a little bit more like they're mixed, kind of, we do believe that they're an entire species of their own and not a mix, but it is a different look, right? Um, so uh, we are constantly finding new species and constantly finding new ghost species at this point of our lives. Like, that's one of the things that I really love about being in this field right now, is because we are in the middle of really finding all sorts of new information all the time right now in this field, from new ways that, speciation occurs, and the way that we just found out how our speciation occurred, to, new species, to the buildings that we found, right? No, we have three ghost species in Africa, but to my understanding, I don't think any of the other ghost species are African, unless the seventh ghost species that we found is from Africa. All the other species, except for the three that we see in the Yoruba and the Kwe, they're all outside of Africa. So we've got the one in Australia and the one in Turtle Island, and then one in Neanderthals and Denisovans. And again, I'm not sure where the seventh is. I would kind of assume that the seventh has something to do with Asia because of where the article that was associated with, because it was associated with the article. And within the journal article, the paper done about HLD6, which is in Asia. So I would assume that that other ghost species, that seventh ghost species, is therefore within the same space, right? Because they're studying that space. They're looking at the DNA. A ghost species is a species that we see some of the genetics of that species within us, but we haven't found the species in the fossil record. So, like with Neanderthal and Denisovan, we see a few of their genes within us, just like maybe the gene for high altitude oxygen that we see of Denisovans uh, within people in Asia, right? Within people in Tibet. So, a ghost species, we see a few of their genes in us, but we haven't found that species in the um, uh, we haven't found that species in the fossil record yet, or at least if we have, we haven't gotten DNA. So, like, we haven't gotten DNA from Homo florensis or Homo naledi or Homo luzonensis, just because of the fact that the fossils that we have from them are too degraded to get DNA, because DNA degrades like everything else, right? And so, ghost species, we just haven't found the full genome of them. We have a full genome of Neanderthal and a full genome of Homo Denisovan, so we can actually like look and compare. Oh, this gene obviously comes from this, right? And so that's basically what it is. It's just species that we see, we know are there, but we don't know where, right? We have, in some of them, we can see kind of an idea of where, like if you look at Turtle Island indigenous peoples ghost species, and then you look at some of our earliest, or not our earliest finds, but the finds that we have that are earliest in their dating, we can see that there's actually a descendant species of Homo erectus in Turtle Island that we see with the Cerruti mastodons find, with Heot Loca, and with Calico. Uh, the Calico site in Texas. And so this tells us that the ghost species within Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyali indigenous people is probably from whatever descendant species of Homo erectus made those sites. But because we haven't found fossils of them, or if we have, we've kind of tossed them away in somebody's attic or in their basement, because archaeology and anthropology was really or grave robbery in its starting. Because of that, we're not sure what the species is. So we see the same thing with Australia, because Australia has the Moy Hill site, which is 120,000 years ago, which would correlate with the ghost species within them. Luca, um, I don't know what Luca is. Is it like initials for something? The Denisovan altitude gene might actually be present in Peruvians. That's actually a really good thought process. That might actually be what it is that creates. Um, well, so I would think that it's a descendant species of Homo erectus, like it's Neanderthal as a descendant species of Homo erectus. Homo erectus really makes it across the globe, and so all the species that we see outside of Africa, well, all the species we see even inside of Africa, are all descendants of Homo erectus, right? Oh, last universal common ancestor. Okay, I haven't heard it talked about like that. Last universal common ancestor, like for everything, that's like, yeah, I mean, like we believe that we all were, we all have a common ancestor as far back as we can go. Like if you can take it back to the very farthest, you can find a common ancestor for everything on the planet, right? Um, I know what the common ancestor like between us and Neanderthal is, and I know what the common, or one of the common ancestors between us and like chimpanzees. But I don't really study outside of human lineage. Like I study hominin and human lineage, so I wouldn't be able to give you information on them, unfortunately. Um, but we do know as scientists that, like everything descends from one common ancestor in the beginning, right? Like in the beginning, and a lot of times, it's like a single cell organism, things like that, right? So we do know that there's no DNA that we have that's not terrestrial, right? So like the idea that there's alien DNA is a falsity. Aliens didn't make us. That doesn't mean that there are not aliens out there. I'm a firm believer in aliens. I do believe that it's way more like Star Trek and the Prime Directive. We haven't reached a point where we're not going to kill each other, so they're not willing to come down and interact with us yet. But we do know that all of the DNA that we see on Earth is terrestrial, and like we share our DNA with pretty much everything else on this planet. Like you share 95% of your DNA with bananas, right? And that really is because of the fact Homo sapiens did populate Abya, and who we have here, Turtle Island indigenous people, are definitely Homo sapiens. But when we look at the Ceruti Mastodon find and the Hayot Loka find, these sites, some of them predate Homo sapiens existence, right? And so they wouldn't be Homo sapien sites. And they definitely predate when Homo sapien is out of Africa, when Homo sapien has left the Levant area. And so they are definitely not Homo sapien sites at that early. That does not mean that Turtle Island indigenous people and Abya indigenous people aren't Homo sapien. We are absolutely Homo sapien. It just means that there was another species here that speciates from Homo erectus here, like we see that Neanderthal speciates from Homo erectus in Europe, and Denisovan speciates from Homo erectus in Asia, is what it means. I can't explain octopus DNA. Again, I really only focus on humans. I really only focus on our lineage and how we evolved and how we came into being and where we got where we are today and why we got where we are today. Um, and that's mainly because I've been an ancestral worshiper my entire life. And because I've been an ancestry worshiper my entire life, I have a real focus on my ancestry, right? And because my ancestry is global and very, very mixed, um, I then had to figure out, all of it, right? All of it. So all Homo sapiens do evolve within Africa. Absolutely. Um, there are other species that evolve outside of Africa that we find in our DNA, and everybody has DNA from other species that evolved outside of Africa. Um, so Rh negative blood. So all Rh negative blood is one of, so A, B, and C is just a factor of blood. It's based on the antibodies that we see around the cell of the blood itself. And Rh is the same thing. There are about, I think it's like 46 Rh factors around your blood. And the Rh capital D factor is the Rh factor that if the mother doesn't have it, then her child, her second child, not her first child creates antibodies in her body against the Rh factor, because again, the Rh factors are all the Rh things are antibodies. So it creates antibodies because their antibody wasn't there, and therefore makes her treat the next pregnancy as if it's an invasion. But that's the only thing that Rh does. 49, probably. My numbers are almost always like, I have a hard time with some numbers. And I don't really usually focus on Rh factor. I have actually learned some about it just because I have a lot of people who ask me about blood. And actually, Rh negative can be found in almost every population across the planet. And they're it's pretty equal. There's two that are like 19% of the population is Rh negative. But other than that, it's pretty equal, right? The amounts of Rh, hey, beautiful. It's Rh, the amount of people who are Rh negative in the population is pretty low, and pretty equal across different populations. So really all it is just a different way that we type blood. And the only thing that it matters in is in pregnancy. It doesn't do anything else. It just, if you're negative, you have a positive child, right? And the positive child that you have makes it problematic. I'd rather go to the past myself. So the other species, we do not know their names. That's why we call them ghost species, because we haven't found the whole genome of them yet in the fossil record. And so we do not know who they are. And so we call them a ghost species. So we don't have names of them. The species that we do know of are Neanderthal and Denisovan. And we do see that we have Neanderthal and Denisovan. We've named Neanderthal and Denisovan because we have found fossils from them and gotten DNA from those fossils. Well, we named them before we got DNA from the fossils. But how we know that they're the ones, some of the ones that we see in us is because we've gotten DNA from their whole genome. Um, when we are finding other species of humans, we name them after where we find them, right? So Neanderthal is found, it means Neander Valley. Neander means is the name of the valley, and Tal means valley. So Neanderthal was found in Neander Valley in Germany. Denisovan was found in the Denisova caves. Florensis was found on the island of Flores. Longi was found in the Rhone cave. Means dragon in Mandarin. And Luzonzensis was found on the island of Luzon, and Naledi was found in the Rising Star Caves. Naledi means star. And so we name other species over after where we found them. And so we don't have names for species that we don't have names for the ghost species yet because we don't have DNA for the ghost species outside of our DNA. And so we don't know where they're from or what species they are, right? I too have a perpetual erection for paleoanthropology. I totally feel you, trumpeter, like totally turned on by paleoanthropology on a daily basis, right? So with Turtle Island Indigenous people, we see that people that have Turtle Island Indigenous people have Neanderthal and Denisovan and then a ghost species, and we don't know yet what the name of that species is. I kind of think it's Homo giganticus. That's what I go by because when we look at the finds in Turtle Island, we have skeletons that are giant finds. So I kind of, like we don't have a name for it, but I'm just going to think in my head of it as Homo giganticus, right? Lucy is Ethiopian, and Lucy is one of our ancestors. Lucy is one of the ancestors of Homo erectus, so Lucy helped create us, right? So absolutely, Lucy is from Ethiopia. When we're talking about the other ones, so when we talk about some of the other ones, when we look at like Homo habilis, that's not named after where he's from. That's named after the fact that they thought for the longest time that he's the one that created the Oldowan tool complex, and so they called him Handyman. But we know now that it was Paranthropus boisei that created the Oldowan tool complex. Homo erectus is named Homo erectus because he's upright. And so he was our first understanding that there were other humans, or not other humans before us, because we knew Neanderthal was before us and we found Neanderthal before we found Homo erectus. But he was our first one that we found outside of Neanderthal that we saw as an upright man. And so we thought of him as our first man until we found Homo habilis, right? So we see that and the reason that these species are not named after where they're found so much as what we associate them with is because many of these species are all found together. So you see that you'll have sites that have Homo erectus and Homo habilis in them together. So you can't name these two different species after the same site, right? You can't name them both Neanderthal because then you have two separate species that have the same name, right? Latin is everything in science and medicine. That's really the European racism, though. When science starts, they want to take it all back to their European central thought process because it was, like they didn't want to understand and see that, science is really indigenous, like indigenous people everywhere had science, in fact, Europe had science before the church erased it. And so when they're trying to take it back, they went to Greece and Rome because of the fact that by going to Greece and Rome, they were wide enough for them. They felt comfortable enough for them, right? Their racism and they're nasty, right? And so we see that really within Western science and Western medicine, everything is named in Latin words so that they can associate it with white superiority, right? With the idea that whites are a superior race. And so that's why pretty much everything is named in Latin, right? And with that, that's also where we see a lot of the roots of a lot of the problems that we have with it, right? Um, so we are at like 141, and I've been talking for probably half an hour at this point. Let me go ahead and kind of do my introductory spiel that I like to do, because at this point, we do have people in here who are not here every day, right? So let me go ahead and do a little bit of who I am and what we're doing and why we're doing it. My name is Widda, and I am an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a historian, a storyteller, and a healer. I'm globally mixed indigenous. That indigeneity includes to Turtle Island, and it really does include to every part of the globe. When I say globally mixed, it is literally everywhere. I have degrees in science and medicine. I am a disabled war vet, so I'm unable to work. And as such, I have things that I want to do. And so I use TikTok as a platform to educate people. I am not trying to give you a college level degree. I'm not trying to give you a college level education. I'm just giving you basic information so that you can go and find more information. Unfortunately, education currently is kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall, and it is gate kept with language that even those of us with extensive degrees sometimes have a hard time understanding. I have a broad vocabulary and extensive degrees, and sometimes I have to research every single word in a paragraph because there are a lot of $10 words in that paragraph, right? And so with that, I use TikTok as a platform to give a base level education on paleoanthropology and Bronze and Iron Age Europe. I, in part, do this because I think that everybody should have a greater education. The reason I do stuff on Bronze and Iron Age Europe is because I was asked by many of the communities that I belong to help with the fact that there are many allies and accomplices out there who are trying to find their own heritage without appropriating other people's culture, trying to find their own ancestry without appropriating other people's culture. And so I come in here to try and give people an understanding of how to find their own ancestry and their own way to reconnect without appropriating other cultures, so that they can speak to their own ancestors and not to other people's ancestors. I teach that race has been debunked. We will probably get into that conversation at some point. We almost always do. And as such, my field created the theory of race. My field debunked the theory of race. The theory of race was created by Europeans to justify their atrocity. And it is a field or a theory that's been debunked. Race does not exist. It's a colonial construct, and it's meant to keep you in check so people can maintain power over you. And so I don't want to deal with your racism in my chat. I'm also really, really against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anything that is hate based on religion. That is a religion based on a atrocious, narcissistic, warmongering God. So I don't want your God in my chat either, if you believe in that God. But I really don't want to hear your Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. I also don't want to deal with your phobias based on gender and desire. There are 3 biological sexes: male, female, and intersex. And your phobia based on that is really disgusting to me. I personally am a 2-spirit. Gender identity is about what I feel I am. It is not about what you think I am. And for you to think that you have the right to decide for somebody else is really egotistical and sanctimonious and bullshit. So I don't want to deal with your phobias based on gender and desire. You also don't get to choose how other people have sex. And I also really ask that you treat with kindness just because you're being treated with kindness. If you think that I'm wrong on something, you might be right. I'm not always right. I think I'm right a lot of the time, but I'm not always right. And I acknowledge that. And I think that, anybody who thinks they're right all of the time is wrong. So if you think that I'm incorrect about something, that's more than welcome within my chat. I just ask that you tell me what I'm wrong about, and you tell me what's wrong about it. Give me a source, give me an idea, give me something to go and look at and educate myself further. Because if I'm lacking education in a subject, I want to get the education in that subject, right? So you're more than welcome to say, hey, Widda, that's wrong. This says this. Just don't sit there and go, I'm lying, because I'm not. I'm giving you the information as I understand it. So it's not a lie. And I might be wrong, that doesn't mean that I am willfully, right? And I would not ever be willfully ignorant. So if you think that I'm wrong, please tell me why and tell me what source I can go and look up and see what's going on and where I might actually be wrong. And so that's kind of my little spiel. If it gets bad in the comments, sometimes it does. It tends to be very trolly in here when we get the anti-science nuts or we get people who are just hate-based. So if it does get trolly, I will turn off the comments. My YouTube is on the screen behind me. My YouTube is always streaming when my TikTok is streaming. So you can actually go over there and make comments if the comments are turned off here. But I will always turn the comments back on because asking questions is an important part of learning. Asking questions is an important part of educating yourself. And this is completely about education of self. Thank you, everybody, for the kind and beautiful comments. I am kind of focused on doing other things. I do this so that I don't react to all of the comments because I will react to all of the comments. Hey, squirrel. Are you the only one wanting? Is anybody else having a hard time hearing me? Um, so if it gets bad in the comments, I should have a couple of mods in here. I usually have a couple of mods in here. If it gets bad in the comments, please, mods, go ahead and pin a comment because that will catch me. Okay. Maybe, I don't know, crazy. I'm not sure why. If it gets bad in the comments, please pin something to me so that I can see, and I'll go ahead and turn the comments off for as long as we need to. And ensure that we maintain the safe space that my chat should be. My chat is meant to be a safe space. It's meant to be a discussion. Well, not a discussion forum because we're not discussing, I'm talking. But it is meant to be an educational forum and is not meant to be a space where you're being attacked. It's not meant to be a space. Nice. It's not meant to be a space where you're dealing with shit, right? It's supposed to be a space where we're all dealing with kindness and love and learning something new, right? So if it gets bad in here, I'll go ahead and turn it off. Oh, do we have like a we're also not going to do erasure in here. We don't erase groups of people in here. It's not appropriate. Usually my mods are I've always had like 30 mods since the moment I got mods because like it's always been bad. I think I have several in here right now looking, so I do think we're okay. I know that my daughter is in here and she is one of my mods, and I know Sava's in here, and I think that I saw Sleepy in here. So I do believe that I have mods. If it gets bad and I don't have enough mods, I can go ahead and I will add you to the list, but I have to go in. Oh, did I remove you? I'm sorry, baby girl. I have to go in and remove people to add new people to my mods. So if you're a mod in here, could you go ahead and say hey so that I know that I have you guys in here? I did see Sava, but I haven't. I think I saw Sleepy come in, but I'm not positive. Just so that I can make sure that we have a few. And if we don't have a lot, I can go ahead and pop some off and put a couple in so that we can make sure. Just so that we can make sure that we're not getting too nasty in here. I don't deal with racism or not racism, it's erasure in here. I also said I don't deal with racism in here. I don't deal with erasure in here. So if you're coming in here with your ethnocentrism, we were just talking before you came in about the fact that Turtle Island Indigenous people by DNA are Turtle Island Indigenous people. We have proof of that. We have proof that we were here for 54,000 years at least. And so if you're going to come in here and try and erase an entire group of people and contribute to the white supremacy issues that we have within our country, you can take it elsewhere. Your white supremacy is not welcome in my chat. So if that's what you're coming in doing, if you are an ethnocentric contributing to the white supremacy that is around our country, I need you to take it elsewhere or you will be muted. And, you know, you'll probably be pissed about it, but you can be pissed about it because I'm not happy with it either. Right. So with all of that, okay, so let me go ahead and I do believe that I do only have one in here. So let me go ahead and TikTok or YouTube, I'm going to move my camera for just a minute so you're aware of what's going on. Let me go ahead and change this up just a little bit so that we can make sure that we have enough people within here to keep this going instead of so that we're not ending up with a lot of people being shitty, because we all know just how that goes, right? So let me go ahead. And of course, if you're in here and I have removed you as a mod and you want to be back in as a mod, you're more than welcome to come back in as a mod. I just probably needed to put other people in here. And that's why. Haven, are you still in here, Lovety? And Aurora, maybe my fingers will work. I do ask, if you're modding, that you only mute people for 5 minutes the first time tops, so that we're not, sometimes people aren't actually trying to be shitty, or maybe they're just misunderstanding. And sometimes it's hard to tell when there's a lot of people being shitty. So I do ask that if you are muting people, that you only mute them for a period of time, for the first time at least, so that they can come back up, so that they can actually interact if they weren't trying to be a shitty human being in the first time. Other than that, that's really my big thing, is I just want to make sure that, there are times when it gets really bad in here where it's hard to tell whether or not somebody was actually being, whatever. And so I want to make sure that people get a chance to be seen and heard still, if that wasn't their intent. And a lot of times people will be trying to help with what's going on in the chat, and it will come across differently. And I want to make sure that people don't end up being muted because of it. So that's really the only thing that I ask with that. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Homo erectus and some of the species that came before us. And when we're talking about this, it's important to understand, a few things about us that we don't really typically understand. One of the things that I want everybody to understand as we go into this is the fact that we're talking about our last common ancestor between us and most of the other species. And because we're talking about our last common ancestor between us and most of the other species, this is somebody who is our grandfather, no matter how many different species we have within us. The other thing that I want people to understand is a couple of vocabulary lessons. And the first vocabulary thing that I want people to understand is what the difference between tribe and band is. A tribe is a community that citizenship is based on genetic lineage, who your parents were. A band is a community that is based not on genetic lineage, but based on belonging to the community, based on skills, based on different things. So the United States is a band. You can immigrate to the United States, you can come to the United States, and you can get citizenship within the United States, and it has nothing to do with who your parents were. This is a band. Those who are Judaic belong to a community based on genetic lineage. You have to be born Judaic to be Judaic, right? And so that's a community based on genetic lineage. So this is the difference between tribe and band. Often we use the word tribal to mean primitive, and it is not. Tribal just means a community that is based on genetic lineage instead of a community that is based on need and skill. When we are looking at the earliest groups of humans, these humans were all in communities based on bands. They were not based on genetic lineage. They were based on whether or not you had enough people to be people, right? Whether or not you had enough people to see that all of your needs were met, and they were not based on who you were born to. This is actually how Homo erectus comes to speciate and how we come to speciate. Up until last year, or this last year, we have understood as scientists that speciation comes through isolation and adaptation. So we know that Homo neanderthal speciates in Europe because they're isolated from the other species of human. And in that isolation, and they're adapting to a space, they become a distinct species. Whereas we now know that Homo erectus and Homo sapien come from what we call speciation through convergence. Speciation through convergence is something that has been thought to be a theoretical method of speciation until this last year. And speciation through convergence in the last year that we found out is something that applies to both Homo erectus and us. So what we have figured out is that Homo erectus speciates through the convergence of Australopithecine lucy. Paranthropus boisei, who we found out last year is actually our first tool maker, not Homo habilis, and Homo habilis. So Homo erectus comes because these three species are living together, and in their living together, they're mating, they're intermixing, and in their intermixing, that intermix creates Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus is a species that we know of that is very broad in its morphology. We haven't gotten DNA from Homo erectus or from any of what we consider to be Homo erectus's subspecies yet, but we do see that within their skeletal morphology, they seem to have a very broad skeletal morphology. Now, we do believe that they're all living together, and we do believe that they are all subspecies of Homo erectus, right? Instead of being individual unique species, like Homo heidelbergensis is a subspecies of Homo erectus, and Homo antecessor is a subspecies of Homo erectus, because we find that they're all living together in the same bands, and that it is this living together in the same bands that actually creates Homo sapien, right? It is that interbreeding and that mixing together in the same bands that actually creates Homo sapien. So our recent understanding of how Homo sapiens speciates through a method of convergence is that Homo sapiens starts speciating through that method of convergence in different bands across Africa. So you'll see that the first one that we have evidence of 300,000 years ago is in Morocco in North Africa. And when we see that, what we see is that this species of Homo sapien, or this Homo sapien, is living in a band of other species. So speciating through maybe an antecessor and an ergaster getting together and creating a baby, and maybe a erectus and a heidelbergensis are getting together and creating a baby, and those two babies look like Homo sapien. It is different morphology, different features. We see that the first evidence that we have of this is in Morocco and North Africa. We see another evidence roughly in the same time period in Ethiopia of this happening, where a band of different groups of subspecies of Homo erectus are living together. And because they're living together and they're creating babies together, Homo sapien comes out of this. This is speciation through convergence. And our current understanding of how Homo sapien comes out of this is that we come out of this in three different groups, and that we don't actually merge together and become a singular species until about 135 to 125,000 years ago. By this time, we're actually already out of what we consider Africa today, though it is still attached to Africa at the time, in the Levant area. And we're already mixing with and interbreeding with Neanderthals. So this speciation through convergence is a new understanding of a method of speciation that just developed within the last year. And we understand that Homo erectus and us both come from this method of speciation. This method of speciation seems to have given us a broader understanding of the world, just like it gave Homo erectus a broader understanding of the world. We know some things about Homo erectus that are actually pretty cool. We know that Homo erectus is the first of us to use fire. We know that Homo erectus is the first of us to use clothes. We know that Homo erectus literally makes it completely across the globe. As we were just talking, there's evidence of Homo erectus making it to Turtle Island. There's evidence of Homo erectus making it to Australia, as well as all the other spaces that we see other species at. These are places that Homo erectus makes it to, and Homo erectus speciates in these areas, speciates through adaptation in these areas, right? This is a safe space. I want everybody to remember that this is a safe space. So I'm going to ask that you remember it's a safe space. If something is happening, maybe take a step back, right? It is a safe space. We're not using slurs in my chat, are we? Please tell me that you're not in my chat using slurs. Okay. So when we see that Homo erectus speciates through convergence, yeah, it can be really annoying and distracting. Okay, well, we can take care of that actually. Let's just go ahead and take care of it. So Erectus isn't necessarily right before Sapien. Erectus is kind of our grandfather. So think of Erectus as the grandfather and having many children. And the many children that Erectus has is where our fathers and our mothers come from. So the many children that Erectus has includes Homo heidelbergensis, Homo antecessor, Homo ergaster. These are all, I think of them as the children of Homo erectus. And I think of Homo erectus as our grandfather, right? So this is grandpa's kids, and grandpa has a whole bunch of kids, and those whole bunch of kids have a whole bunch of kids, right? And each of those kids, as they move across the globe or as they speciate in the areas that Homo erectus has moved into, because heidelbergensis comes from Homo erectus being in Europe, right? Though there are African heidelbergensises as well. So as Homo erectus is moving across the globe and speciating in these different areas, these are our parents in these different areas, right? And so as we're coming into these areas, and as our parents are coming into these areas and becoming a part of us, we see that this, or not becoming a part of us, but creating us, we see that Homo erectus is our grandfather in that case, right? I also like to think of the other species as our cousins because that's kind of genetically what they are. So when we look at Homo neanderthal and Homo denisovan and Homo florensis and Homo luzonensis, these species all come from the same groups of species that we come from because they all come from antecessor and heidelbergensis and ergaster, and they all have the same grandfather in Homo erectus. So this Homo erectus is on the screen behind me because that's who's on the screen behind me, is actually found in Java. And this Homo erectus is 1.9 million years ago. So, or not 1.9, 1 million years ago. Sorry, 1.9 million years ago is a tooth in Georgia. 1 million years ago. So this Homo erectus would absolutely be dark of skin because the alleles for light skin don't show up in any of our species until 900,000 years ago. And so this predates that by about 100,000 years. So we're definitely looking at somebody who would have been dark of skin. And we're definitely looking at somebody who had, their ancestors or them had started out in Africa and then they had moved out and moved into different spaces. And the space that they had moved into would have been Indonesia. So they might be the ancestor of the ergaster or the erectuses that were in Indonesia that then became Homo florensis in Indonesia, right? So when we're looking at how Homo erectus makes it across the globe, we see that Homo erectus, the reason we call him erect man is because he is the first to really have what we call expedient bipedalism, which means that the way his lower body is shaped and the way his feet are shaped means that he can make it across the globe. He can walk everywhere. He walks everywhere, right? And because he walks everywhere, he's able to make it to Europe. He's able to make it to Asia. He's able to make it to the islands of the South Pacific. He's able to make it to Australia. Now, and he's able to make it to Turtle Island and Abiyala. For those who don't know, Turtle Island is North America and Abiyala is South America. Now, we also know that Homo erectus was able to cross water to do this. The island of Flores in Indonesia and the Isle of Luzon in the South Pacific, they're both below what we call the Wallace Line. The Wallace Line is this extremely deep trench that is in between Australia and Asia, Southeast Asia. And this extremely deep trench has never been above the water line. And so because this extremely deep trench has never been above the water line, it's a trench within the sea, we know that anybody on the south side of that, when they started on the north side of that as a species, had to cross water to get there. So when we see that the island of Flores in Indonesia has people on it, we know that that's because they had to cross water to get there. When we see that the island of Luzon in the South Pacific has people on it, they had to cross water to get there. So we know that Homo florensis had the ability to cross water to get to these spaces. When we see that there is a ghost species and evidence of a species in Australia and in Turtle Island and Abiyala, we see that they had to cross water to get to these spaces, right? So because of that, we have the knowledge that Homo erectus was absolutely crossing water. We don't necessarily have the knowledge of how they crossed water, and it might not be something that's easy to find. We did just find evidence of wooden buildings in Africa that Homo heidelbergensis made at 500,000 years ago. But wood is one of those things that has a tendency to degrade in the archaeological record really quickly. Um, Everything on the planet degrades, right? Everything on the planet is biodegradable. Even plastic degrades. It just takes much longer than everything else, right? So, because of that fact, um, we know that they've crossed water because we can see where they've crossed water. We can see species in these spaces that they had to cross water to get to. We don't know how they crossed water because we haven't found the instruments that they used to cross water, the boats that they used to cross water. Now, it stands to reason that we're probably looking at wooden boats or wood frames with some form of animal hide over them. You can use like seal hide, or you can use like whale skin, things like that, and make it waterproof so that you can cross water. Most likely, though, I would say it's most likely wooden boats. Just from my thought process, that doesn't mean that we won't find a whale skin boat next year, right? In this field right now, everything is really changing really fast, and we're finding really new information about everything in my field right now, which is one of the things that I love about this field right now. And so we know that Homo erectus has the capacity and the ability somehow to cross water. The other things that we know about Homo erectus is these are the first people that we have that use fire. And the usage of fire actually gives us a lot of things. The usage of fire isn't just warmth. It just isn't, keeping the predators away. And it is absolutely cooking our food, but the act of cooking our food actually gives a lot of things that we don't typically acknowledge or we don't typically understand. And so I want to go over, first of all, how science or how fire is really one of our first evidences of science, right? So science is I see something or observe it in nature, and I have a hypothesis of what my observation means, and then I predict what that hypothesis might mean. And then I test that prediction. And if that testing proves true, then I have a theory. And if that testing proves false, I go back to my hypothesis and retest. If it is proven true and I have a theory, in science, it has to be retestable. To actually be something that's factual, we have to retest it constantly. We have to really be looking at it. This is how we both created the theory of race and debunked the theory of race, right? We have to continue to look at it. So when we are looking at the ability of science to create fire, what we're looking at is now obviously fire is something that can occur naturally, right? Have lightning strike a tree. And that tree is going to catch on fire, right? So fire is something that can absolutely occur naturally in the environment. And so if it has occurred naturally in the environment and something sees it and observes it and then makes a hypothesis or an idea based on that, and then kind of makes a prediction of what that means. So say I observe a tree getting hit by lightning, and when I observe that tree getting hit by lightning, there is a cat in that tree. And when that cat in that tree catches on fire, that cat cooks, dies, and it cooks, right? Probably got electrocuted anyways, and it cooks in that tree. And so now I smell the cooked meat, and I'm like, ooh, that smells good. That smells much better than that raw meat smelled yesterday. And so I, through my observation of nature and through smelling this, realize, well, if I used fire to cook my meat, maybe if I bring like my pig that I killed yesterday over here and hold it over the tree, then I can actually cook my pig, right? This is a prediction, right? And then I can take that prediction, right? And by taking that prediction, I can therefore bring my pig over and test it, right? So I bring my pig over and I test it, and I realize that my pig cooks. My pig cooks. I can eat it. I'm probably also eating the cat because it smells really good. So now I'm like, well, what am I going to do about this to make sure that I can continue this? Right. So maybe I take a piece of wood from that tree where it was burning. And with that piece of wood, I take it back to camp and I keep it as my own fire. Now, of course, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing with this. It does probably need to be fed. I might understand that. So maybe I keep it alive for a while. maybe I husband it for a while. So, this is a hypothesis that I am making about the way that it is possible that Homo erectus has its first interaction with fire. Now, we know that fire can be made in a few different ways or it can be kept in a few different ways, but we're not sure how Homo erectus decided to do it. A couple of different ways that we can observe the concept of the start of fire is maybe this tree is it and they take the branch home and they're keeping the branch and they realize that they have maybe the first branch that they take home dies, right? Well, why did it die? So now I have to figure out how to keep the next one I find alive. And so now I have to feed it. And I start to understand that I have to feed it. But now, if somebody's not watching over it constantly, it still dies out. And because somebody's not watching over it constantly and it dies out, I now have to understand how to keep it going. So maybe now I understand that I'm going to take like a little piece of the coal from that fire and I'm going to maybe put that little piece of the coal over on a rock because I want to keep it separate. I want to make sure that it doesn't burn up. But of course, I put that little piece of that coal over on the rock and the coal dies because it has nothing to feed it. So now I'm like, okay, well, I have to feed that fire to keep it going. How do I feed this coal? I'm going to put some leaves around this coal. And the leaves I put around this coal are going to make the coal stay alive. Well, the coal eats the leaves, eats it up fast, right? And so now the leaves aren't working and that's not working. So what am I going to do next? Well, I know that it doesn't really like water, but I don't want to put it out. So maybe what I do is I put a little bit of moistness on the leaves, like maybe a little bit of moist leaves around the coal. Or maybe I put a little bit of dry leaves around the coal and then put moist leaves outside the dry leaves, right? And so now I figured out how to get it to kind of stay, but it keeps catching a lot and it has too much oxygen. So maybe now I decide to put it in a shell that I have and give it just a little bit of oxygen and not overfeed it with oxygen so that maybe it'll just burn slowly in this shell. These are some steps that could possibly be made to the step of keeping a coal in a closed or semi-closed container that has both moist and dry tinder within it, which is one of the ways that we can keep coals alive, right? So maybe it took me years, generations to get to this point, but this experimental phase of this until I get to the point where I understand how to keep the fire and understand how to ensure that my fire stays is science. It is this interaction with nature. It is observation. It is theory after being tested and after proving true, right? So this is where we see that Homo erectus's first usage of fire and first control of fire, not usage, but control of fire, is actually a scientific thought process that goes all the way back to Homo erectus having a scientific thought process. Now, of course, there could be other ways that this started. Maybe I'm flint knapping. Homo erectus is not the first to create tools. Like I was saying earlier, Paranthropus boisei is the first to create tools, right? Yet Homo erectus is the first to adapt tools. As humans, one thing that sets us apart is that we adapt our adaptations. Many different species on this planet have adaptations, but we're the only species that adapts our adaptations, right? And so Homo erectus is the first to actually do that. They adapt their adaptations. And so maybe what's happening is Homo erectus is making tools because they've seen tools from Paranthropus boisei, and so they make tools. And of course, they've thought of their own ways, and so they have a Schulian hand axes. As they're making tools, maybe they're making tools in a bed of leaves. Maybe they're just sitting there making tools, and a spark flies while they're flint knapping, and that spark hits in the bed of leaves, and that catches fire. And so now they understand or get this concept that you can create a spark with your tools as you're flint knapping, and that spark will catch fire, and you can feed leaves to that spark. It'll eat them all up and it'll stay fire, right? So maybe this is how we see that start of creating fire. So we have thought for a long time that Homo habilis made tools first. It is only within the last year that we've realized that it was actually Paranthropus boisei that made tools first, or Nutcracker Man. So this is a couple of different ways that we can get to the start of making a fire. Now, making a fire is an extremely important movement forward for humanity as a whole. This is the thing that gives us our brains. When you cook your meat, it gives you more caloric intake for less amount. So you get more calories per ounce when you cook it. when you cook any of your food. And this is because it pre-digests it. And when it pre-digests your food and you get more calories per ounce of food, when you are building brains, so from birth to full brain development, when you are building your brains, the extra calories that you take that don't just give you the ability to live actually gives you the ability to go to your brain and increases your brain development, gives you a larger brain, gives you more brain development. So we see that if Paranthropus boisei is our first tool maker, and if Homo erectus is our first instance of fire, then Homo erectus using fire to cook their food gives the ability for food to create larger brains. And this is how we as sapiens get our larger brains, because the larger brain goes to the children, right? Because the larger brain, the more caloric going to the brain goes to the children whose brains are developing, right? And so we're seeing that it is Homo erectus's use of fire and ability to cook their food that gives their children and their grandchildren larger brains, which is how we in Neanderthals got our larger brains. Neanderthals actually have larger brains than we do. So the other thing that this gives us that is very closely related is better capability with hunting tools. When we look at the earliest tools that we have, the earliest tools that we have are not hunting tools. We're seeing blades for knives. We're seeing hammer stones and cobblestones. A cobblestone is a flat stone that you put on the ground. You put something on top of the cobblestone, and then you hit whatever it is with a hammer stone. Maybe you put bone there, and by hitting it with the hammer stone, you break it open and you can get the marrow out of it, or you can get different tools like awls and stuff out of it, right? So we're not seeing the usage and then we see with Erectus that they use the Acheulean hand axe, but the Acheulean hand axe is not something that you're hunting with. It's something that you hold in your hand. It's not something you're attaching to a piece of wood. So these earliest tools aren't necessarily something that we're hunting with. They're something that we're processing our hunted stuff with. And so we see with Homo erectus that they start this usage of wooden spears. Now, as we're looking at wooden spears, many people are like, oh, you just go and cut down a tree and you can make a spear. But the thing is if you go and you were to cut down a tree, even if you're cutting down a really good straight tree, and you were to sharpen the end with a blade, because you have blades, you're going to ruin or weaken the integrity of the wood. So when you ruin or weaken the integrity of the wood by sharpening that point's going to mushroom out when you hit an object. I don't know if you ever created spears when you were a child. You're fine, Saba. I don't know if you ever, had that interaction. My sons did. And they would create spears, and then they would try and hit things with the spears. My daughter's in here and she can attest to that. They would try and hit things with the spears. And when they tried to hit things with the spears, the point of the spear would mushroom out. Because when you just sharpen a piece of wood to create a spear, you are breaking the integrity of the wood. Yet if you were to take that piece of wood and you were to put it next to the fire and heat it up and then roll it away and then heat it up and then roll it away and then heat it up and then roll it away, what you're doing is what we know of today, even within steel. It's called tempering. And so you can temper the wood. And by tempering the wood, you therefore make the spear harder, right? So we can see that you can make the spear harder that way, and then you can make your point that way and make a point that isn't going to mushroom out. So what you do is you would stick that tip of that spear into the fire, right? And then you can go with that tip after you get a good burn on it. You can use that against a rock next to your fire, and you can kind of grind it off or sand it off. And so you can do that kind of circularly and create a point. And this point is hard because you've tempered your wood and you haven't broken the integrity of the wood by burning the tip and sanding it off. And so you can see that you can create the ability to create a spear that is stronger out of wood with fire. So fire not only gives us the ability to cook our food and therefore to create a bigger brain, but it also gives us the ability to create better tools for hunting our food. And so we see that this is our first instances of science. This is our first knowledge of science. The same thing happens when we see that Homo erectus is actually adjusting the tools that they inherit from Paranthropus boisei and making new tools, adapting your adaptations, right? So this early instance of fire, this early instance of science, and this early ability to understand different tool usages contributes to pretty much everything. If I am trying to make it somewhere new because I am expediently bipedal and I like to walk, right? It is easier for me to make it somewhere new if I have food that I can carry with me, or if I have, the ability to have a stronger spear to defend myself from whatever animals might be in the new area that I'm moving into, right? Um, the ability to skin our animals, the ability to hunt our animals, the ability to cook this food. This also gives the ability for clothing wearing. And we see that Homo erectus is the first that is wearing clothing. Now, this isn't the tailored clothing that comes much later, right? And what it is I can skin a deer, and I can cut a hole in the skin, and I can put that over me and tie it around my waist, create kind of a poncho effect. So this is our earliest instances of usage of clothing. The reason that we know that this goes back into Homo erectus is because of the presence of body lice and when we can see body lice. Body lice develops from head lice, and it develops from head lice after we lose the fur on our body, after we lose the uh, the um, the hair all over our body, right? And you can't have it develop on a hairless body without something covering the body, right? Because you're going to see the lice wandering down from your head onto your body, and you're going to eat that lice because protein is protein, right? So we see that body lice only starts its development after we both lose our hair and start wearing clothing. And so we know that Homo erectus is wearing clothing. Um, and this also gives them the ability to move into colder areas. Homo erectus, like us, speciates in Africa, and that speciation in Africa is for a hot weather environment, right? A high sun content, hot weather environment. That's why Homo erectus speciates with dark skin, tightly coiled hair, and dark eyes. All of those things are helpful in a hot weather environment. So, as they're moving across the globe and going into environments where the weather is colder, going into environments where they may need to protect themselves from the cold, having clothing helps. Having that ability to cover their body helps. This also provides the ability to create some form of shelter as well, right? Because I am not going to know that there is going to be a cave 100 miles from me, or 30 miles from me, or 20 miles from me. I'm not going to know that, right? That's not something, as I'm walking out and trying to explore the globe, that I'm going to be able to find a cave to shelter myself in every night. I need something to shelter myself, right? And so, because I need something to shelter myself, we can see that the likelihood that Homo erectus is using animal skins to cover, a few sticks, or maybe they're putting together some wooden sticks to create shelter, is absolutely a possibility, right? We have not found evidences of these shelters. That's not something that it's likely to really find a whole lot of evidence of. We did recently, of course, find evidence of Homo heidelbergensis at 500,000 years ago building wooden shelters. That doesn't necessarily translate into 2 million years ago building shelters, but we can assume that there's some form of the ability to shelter yourself at night as people are moving out, as people are moving across space, because people don't tend to move into space that there's no place to shelter yourself from the predators, especially at a time frame when there's a lot of predators about. Of course, fire itself actually helps keep away predators, so you're less likely to run into predators if you have a good fire. Though that absolutely doubles down when you have some form of shelter to put that good fire in. So we do see that Homo erectus leaves Africa at about 1.8 million years ago. A couple years ago, we found a tooth in Georgia, or I guess it was last year, we found a tooth in Georgia that everybody was all freaking out about. Oh my God, there's a human tooth at 1.8 million years ago in Georgia. This means humans were. That was a Homo erectus tooth. We do know that Homo erectus has been out of Africa for roughly 100,000 years after the start of themselves as a species. Homo erectus left Africa and starts moving across the globe really early. Again, that is that expedient bipedalism that we see in Homo erectus. Homo erectus has constantly been on the move. Homo erectus is a scientist. Homo erectus is a curious creature. Homo erectus always wants to see what's over the next horizon, right? And this is something that we absolutely inherit from Homo erectus. So as we see Homo erectus moving out, we see that Homo erectus moves into different spaces. And in some of those spaces, speciates. In some of those spaces, becomes entirely new species. We see Heidelbergensis, Ancestor, or Gaster. Uh, all of these are descendants of Homo erectus. And all of the other species that we see of that we lived alongside of, or that are pretty much our direct cousin species, or that we have within our genetics, are going to all be descendant species of Homo erectus. We also know that Homo erectus has language. We can see that there are patterns for language in the skull. Your brain leaves imprints on the interior of your skull. And in Homo erectus, like in Neanderthal and Homo sapien, we see that there is the imprint for language on the interior of the skull. So we know that Homo erectus has language. And by this, I want to specify that we know that they have the same type of language that we have. Um, every being on this planet has language. Trees have language, plants have language, animals have language. There is interaction and communication in all of these different species. Homo erectus has the same type of verbal language that we do, the syllabic language that we do. And so we see that they do pass this on to all of their different descendant species, that we get our language capabilities from Homo erectus. So as Homo erectus is moving across the globe, they are taking with them fire. They are taking with them language. They are taking with them clothing. They are taking with them new tools. And they seem to also be taking with them the ability to cross water. And so, with all of these different abilities, they pass them down to their different descendant species in each different space, right? So as they're taking this across the globe and taking these to the different species in each space, or their different descendant species are speciating in each space, those different descendant species as they speciate in each space become very adapted to the spaces that they're speciating in. They're not necessarily adapted to Africa like Homo erectus is. um, I think that I've covered all the different things that we see within Homo erectus itself, and how we see those start of those things within Homo erectus. I'm trying to take a second here and make sure I covered language, I covered clothing, covered fire, covered a little bit crossing water. We can touch on that one again a little bit. So again, because of where we see the descendant species of Homo erectus, like in the island of Flores in Indonesia, the ghost species in Australia, and the ghost species in Turtle Island and Abiyala, and the evidence of Homo erectus having made it here and speciating here and there, we do know that Homo erectus crossed water. So the island of Flores in Indonesia is literally in the middle of the Wallace Trench. The Wallace Trench, or the Wallace Line, is this extremely deep trench in the ocean that has never been above sea level. So the islands within it, you had to cross water to get to, and anything below it, you had to cross water to get to. Yes, they had, well, I mean, they had syllabic language like we have syllabic language. So anything below the Wallace line, you have to cross water to get to. So seeing that we have Homo florensis in the island of Flores in Indonesia, Homo luzonensis in the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and then we have what we call the Moy Hill site in Australia, which is a site that is Homo erectus, or a species of Homo erectus, or speciation of Homo erectus, or maybe even Homo erectus. So it's 120,000 years ago, and it is considered that Homo erectus was gone by then. And then the Cerruti Macedon site and the Heotloka site here in Turtle Island, North America, for those who do not know, tells us that Homo erectus crossed into these spaces and speciated into these spaces as well. So we do see that Homo erectus is crossing water. Again, we're not exactly sure how they're crossing water. We can assume that it is most likely wood, that it is most likely wooden boats they're using to cross water, but we're not exactly sure how, right? Are we talking dugout canoes? Are we talking, making rafts? We're not exactly sure, but we can absolutely see that this is absolute evidence that they did, right? So we do know that they're crossing water as they're getting across the globe, which shows that Homo erectus literally does make it to every portion, every corner of the globe. Homo erectus, as it speciates in different corners of the globe, those speciations are adaptations to place. So we know commonly of Homo neanderthalis and Homo denisovan. These are two species that are pretty mainstream knowledge of, that we see within the fossil record, and that most of people are talking about, and everybody's like, oh, I know I have genes of this, or I know we have genes of that. These are two of the species that Homo erectus speciates into. Homo neanderthalis is considered to have come from antecessor and antecessor and heidelbergensis in Europe. So we do know that heidelbergensis is also in Africa. We know that antecessor is also in Africa. These are two species that they think that Homo sapiens speciated from as well. So this would mean that we are pretty close cousins with Homo neanderthalis. The DNA really supports that as well. Homo denisovan, it seems to have speciated in Asia. We're not exactly sure where. Our major finds of Homo denisovan are from the Denisova cave in Russia, and yet the DNA from Homo denisova is seen within Australia, the islands of the South Pacific, the southeastern tip of Asia, and in Turtle Island and Abayali and indigenous peoples. And so because of that, we see that, we found them in a cave in Russia. It's likely that they speciated in Asia, because that's where we're seeing the most of their DNA from, right? There are currently 7 other species that we see in the fossil record, and 7 other species that we see as ghost species within our DNA that we lived alongside of in our earliest coming outs, in our earliest movements. And so I'm going to kind of go over those 7 other species, and I'm going to go over them in the order in which we found them in the fossil record. So the first ones that we find in the hot fossil record, everybody knows about. This has been a part of who we are for a little bit. Though there's not a lot of information. We know they had a language, but we don't know what that language would have sounded like. We don't know, where they would have picked it up from. We do know that our oldest languages that we currently have all have natural sounds within them, all have sounds of nature within them. This is why we hear languages that have clicks and trills within them. Those clicks and trills are sounds that were taken from the languages around you in nature. Again, everything in this world has language. Different languages, patterns are what the difference is. So with the syllabic language patterns that we have, when we're first starting having language, it seems that we're taking those natural sounds, the sounds of nature around us, and incorporating them in our languages. So we can assume that Homo erectus is doing the same, and that its language patterns probably sounded similar to some of the oldest languages that we have currently on the planet. So they probably had a few of those clicks and trills within them. We know that they have language because of the patterns in their skull and because of the shape of their lung capacity. So our lung capacity is really important to how we're able to speak, because I can breathe and speak at the same time. And this is because of the way, no, Jules. But the language is because of the way that the rib cage compresses the lungs, right? And so it gives us the ability to kind of expel air through through our hyoid and through our voice box, right? So when we're looking at Homo erectus, we can see that it is the patterns on their skull base, and then we can see that it is also the shape of their lungs and the shape of their chest. So Neanderthal comes out of heidelbergensis and antecessor, and they started about 6,000 years ago. And they, in fact, our oldest finds of them are actually in Britain. And their whole genome is about 30,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. And they didn't disappear. They became incorporated into us. Pretty much every human being on the planet today has Neanderthal DNA. The only 2 populations on the planet that don't have Neanderthal DNA are the Yoruba population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa. They have ghost species in them, which we will go ahead and be talking about in a minute here. But Neanderthals come out of heidelbergensis and antecessor, and we can see where they're speciating at and when they're speciating at, right? And so uh, we do know that they're coming from the same species that we're coming from. And we do know that actually they share a lot of our DNA. Like there's a lot of similarity between us and Neanderthals. And then, of course, there's more Neanderthal DNA actually alive on the planet today than there was during their time as a species. They were a pretty small species, and this is because they came from. Um, so if you only have a few people that start your genetic line, right? Those few people that start your genetic line are not offering a lot of genetic diversity, right? And so we know that many of the species that come from Homo erectus outside of Africa have a narrower genetic diversity, so they tend to be smaller species. And so we see that Homo neanderthal is going to be a smaller amount of the species. And so we also know that Homo neanderthal went through like two extinction events, basically. And so those two extinction events meant that by the time they met up with Homo sapien, their species was actually very small. They only had about um, 10,000 of their species left. And their species had started to become really inbred because, again, they were very narrow in their genetics. And because their species had started to become inbred, because there were such a small amount of them left, when they met up with Homo sapiens, they really were, that's an influx of genetics. It's a healthy thing, right? And they could recognize that. And so we really intermixed with Neanderthal very heavily. And that's why really everybody on the planet has Neanderthal DNA. Our first intermixings with Neanderthals actually seem to be in Europe, there's some Y DNA that goes into them, like at 200 and something thousand years ago from Homo erect or from Homo sapiens. So like really early on, there were a couple of the earliest of our ancestors who are not our ancestors, but the earliest of our species that seem to have intermixed with them and given them our Y DNA because they don't have a Y DNA. They, in fact, never seem to have a Y DNA. They start with, it seems like having a different DNA, and then they go to having a Denisovan Y DNA, and then they have a sapien Y DNA. It should be understood, or it's not often understood, but it will help for people to understand that Y DNA is actually a degraded X. So the Y chromosome is just a degraded X chromosome. And because it's a degraded X chromosome, what it really supplies is the switch, right? But you can get that switch from the X chromosome. And so it's not necessarily necessary to provide that switch. You can get that switch again from the X chromosome. And so it's possible that they actually just had two X chromosomes. And that does not mean that they would not have had what we would have seen as being male and female, right? It does not mean that they did not have penises and vaginas. What it means is that that caused this switch to penis or vagina was something within an X chromosome. Um, there's a lot more about biological sex that is really not understood, right? And so that's one of those things that kind of needs to be understood is that it's not necessarily about X versus Y chromosome. There are people who are biologically, we view them biologically as male who have two X's and a Y, right? So there's a shift in it and a shift in understanding that needs to come out. Um, so Neanderthal is the first that we found of other human species, right? We had thought that up until this point that we were created by God 6,000 years ago, and everything was biblical. We were starting to see the theory of evolution with Darwin, but it was still so new. And at the same time that he's publishing his theory of evolution, though there is somebody else who come up with the theory beforehand, but at the same time that he's publishing his theory of evolution, the first Neanderthal skull is found in Neander Cave in Neander Valley, right? Or in Neander Valley. And when we see this first skull of Neanderthal, initially it is thought of to be a Homo sapien with some disease morphology, right? It's thought to be one of us. It just has some really weird disease morphology, and that must be what's wrong with its skull. And so we spend about 10 years passing this skull around Europe going, what's this weird disease morphology? And then Darwin's theory of evolution is coming out and people are starting to relate it. And they're starting to go, oh, well, maybe. And we start discovering more Neanderthal skulls. And so when we start discovering more Neanderthal skulls, Darwin's theory of evolution is coming through all of this together. We start to see, okay, so there's other species and we're not 6,000 years old. Of course, at first we think that Neanderthal is our ancestor and not our cousin. And Neanderthal is used very heavily within race theory at the time and within the theory of eugenics at the time. We see that Neanderthal is misrepresented as being dark of skin and being hunched over, and that their mid-face prognosis is misrepresented as being more um, primitive racially, and therefore associated with people from Africa being more primitive. So this was this double down of race theory as they're trying to reach the understanding that the Bible is not correct, but they need to now justify the atrocities that they've been committing for the last few hundred years based on the biblical thought process that certain groups of people are chosen by God and certain groups of people aren't chosen by God, which they have been basing skin color based on that thought process, right? So when we see that early Neanderthal is used very much in kind of doubling down on um, the atrocities, right? Kind of giving weight to the idea that race actually exists, and kind of giving weight to the idea that certain groups are not as genetically or not as advanced as other groups. Of course, we now know just how false that is, just what a fallacy that is, right? Of course, we've also debunked the theory of race. After Homo neanderthal, we see that the next species that we find in the fossil record is at 2000 in 2003. So 20 years ago, almost exactly, we find Homo florensis in the island of Flores of Indonesia. And when we find Homo florensis in the island of Flores of Indonesia, this is weird to us. Of course, we have already found Erectus and Ergaster, but we know that these ones are older than us. We know that these ones aren't really related to us. We find Homo florensis and we realize we're looking at something that lived at the same time as we did, right? Thank you, everybody. And as looking at somebody who's living at the same time as we did, we're also seeing that this species is really kind of different too. So, of course, in 2003 is when we get the start of the Lord of the Rings series going into theater. And so seeing Homo florensis as a 3'5" species, because at their height they're 3'5", they're tallest, that actually has large feet, we really associate this with the hobbits from the Lord of the Rings series. And so our hobbit species is discovered. Now, in the islands of Indonesia, there have been legends the entire time from the indigenous people of a small species that lives in the area of small humans, Panunguma. And when the guy who discovered Homo florensis and who has been down when the guy who's studying Homo florensis is down there still studying Homo florensis, recently he has acknowledged or been starting to look at the fact that there's actually sightings of Homo florensis within the last 50 years. And so there is some questioning or some looking right now as to whether or not Homo florensis actually still exists, if there's actually Homo florensis out there. After Homo florensis in 2010, we find Denisova in Denisovan Cave, right? Now, at this point of time, polymerase chain reaction was developed in the 80s. The woman that developed it, I can't remember her name off the top of my head. Svante Pablo from the, oh, fuck. He actually belongs to a group within Europe that has been doing all these studies. But Svante Pablo won the Nobel Peace Prize last year because he was able to use polymerase chain reaction to fully sequence the Neanderthal genome. After fully sequencing the Neanderthal genome and finding out the ways that they can actually sequence ancient DNA, they start testing all these bones. And in the cave of the Denisova cave in Russia, they have thousands and thousands of bones, and all of them are like tiny, like none of them is bigger than like 2 inches, right? And so we have all of these tiny little bones in this space, right? And they start testing all of these tiny little bones in this space. And as they start testing all these tiny little bones in this space, the testing of the tiny little bones in this space means that they're able to get DNA out of all of these tiny little bones. And in all of the ability to get DNA out of these tiny little bones, they're able to sequence an entirely new species. And in sequencing the entirely new species, they find Denisovan out of a fingertip. It's just a little tip of somebody's finger, and they find an entirely new species. And this is in roughly 2010. So after they find Denisova and they get this through DNA, so they have a full genome of them, they're actually able to see Denisova DNA within our DNA. And they start to go, wow, this is not only a species that lived alongside us, but it's a species that we intermixed with, right? So that's 2010. In 2012, there are some geologists going through the Rising Star Caves in South Africa, and they stumble on a crevice in the wall, and they decide to travel through this crevice. And this crevice is extremely narrow. Most people can't make it through this crevice. As they're going through this crevice, trying to find some geological evidence, they actually find an entirely new species. And the entirely new species that they find is Homo naledi. Unknown Cave of Bones is a documentary on Homo naledi on Netflix right now. It's an amazing documentary. Lee Berger, the person who is running the documentary and giving all the information, is the head archaeologist on the cave or on the Homo naledi site. And they have found out some amazing things about Homo naledi. Homo naledi used torches to carry fire through caves. Homo naledi is 335,000 years ago to 235,000 years ago. Homo naledi buried their dead at a time when nobody else buried their dead. Homo naledi has cave art at a time when nobody else has cave art. They are a short species, and their species is kind of a convergence. It's kind of interesting, right? So we see that their skull and their upper body is all shaped like Australopithecine, like Lucy. And then their lower body, from like their L spine down, is shaped like Homo erectus. It's expediently bipedal. Though the fingers and the toes still have the curve to them that we need for climbing. And their skull, while it's the size of Australopithecine, is shaped like modern Homo sapien. So we see that they actually have the skull shape that we have, which is one of the things that we think actually gives us the intelligence that we have, is the shape of our skull as opposed to the size of our skull. So when we're looking at Homo naledi, we're seeing a species that is around before we even come onto the scene, that is doing things before we're doing them by a couple 100,000 years. We don't actually start our burial of our dead and our decoration of cave walls and our interaction on those levels until after 100,000 years ago. So this is something that is going on 200,000 years before we're doing it, right? So Homo naledi, again, is found in 2012 in the Rising Star Caves in South Africa. And they are one of those things that shows that speciation is not a linear thing. Evolution is not a linear thing because, again, they have a lower body that is shaped like Homo erectus and an upper body that is shaped like Lucy. So it takes it back, right? And then they have a brain that is shaped like ours. And so it takes it forward quite a bit. After finding Homo naledi in 2012, we found two different species in the late 20 teens. So like 2017, 2018, they're first published in 2019. Those two different species, one of them we had actually found the skull of in the 70s, but we hadn't really looked at this skull and seen what was going on. We don't have DNA from this skull, so we're still not exactly sure what we're dealing with. Again, with Denisovan, we only have DNA really of Denisovan. The body parts that we have of Denisovan are so small, we don't actually have a skull. We do have a chunk of the base of the skull. We do know Denisovan have language. This is where the patterns for language are in our skull, actually. And so we do know that Denisovan has language, and we have a chunk of the base of their skull. We have a piece of a mandible, but we don't have the skull cap. What we have of Homo longi is just the skull cap. We don't have DNA. We don't have any other things having to associate with Homo longi. So we're currently unsure whether or not Homo longi and Homo denisovan are the same species or if they're two different species. And then we found Homo luzonensis on the island of Luzon in the South Pacific, right after we discover that Homo longi is its own species and not, a disfigured Homo neanderthalis, right? Right after we decide that Homo longi is its own significant species. And so For a while, these are the 6 species that we see in this fossil record that we live alongside of and that we seem to have had some connection with. In the last 2 months, we have discovered our 7th species. Our 7th species has not been named yet. Our 7th species currently is known by HLD6, which is the grave. The site number or the site name is HLD, and the number of the body pulled out is 6, right? So HLD6 is found in Asia, in China, and HLD6 is interesting. HLD6 is 300,000 years ago, so about the time that we're starting as a species. HLD6 seems to share features with both us and Homo erectus. They're really the only other species that we've seen that seems to share some features with us that are very significant. And these features that it seems to share, it doesn't have our chin, but it has the start of our chin, right? It's not quite what we have for our chin, but it's getting there. And it has a flat face, and we're the first to really have a flat face, though they still have that low sloped forward of Homo erectus, and they have the gap between their teeth and their jaw of Homo erectus and Heidelbergensis, and all the other Homo species. We're the only one that does not have that gap between our final tooth and the back of our jaw. And so HLD6 seems to be kind of forming at the same time we're forming, and forming a little similar. Now, those are the species that we actually have seen the fossils of in the fossil record. And of course, with Denisovan and Neanderthal, not only have we seen the fossils of them in the fossil record, but we've also gotten DNA from them. We haven't gotten any DNA from any of the other species. DNA is one of those things that degrades pretty quick, and the conditions that you find a body in is going to tell you whether or not the DNA is going to last a longer period of time. If the conditions are completely cold and dry, the body is going to last longer. If the conditions are completely submerged in an acidic or absorbic environment like a bog, you're going to see that the DNA lasts longer. But if the DNA is, like in a hot, wet environment, the DNA is going to go away quicker, which is why we don't have DNA from things like Homo naledi, Homo florensis, Homo luzonensis. So with that, we have what we call ghost species. And ghost species are species where we see a little bit of the genomic markers, a little bit of the genes in us or in Neanderthal and Denisovan's DNA, but we haven't found that species in the fossil record that we know of. So maybe Naledi is one of those species, so they say it's not, but we haven't gotten DNA from Naledi, so we can't compare Naledi's DNA to the ghost species DNA to see if that's the correct DNA. So we have 7 ghost species currently within our DNA. The 7th one, I don't know where it's located. That came out with the article that came out recently about HLD6. There's also a 7th ghost species, but it hasn't told us where it's actually located. I might assume that it is within China and that it is within people in Asia, only because of the fact that it's associated with a find in Asia, right? Yet I do not know for certain, so I cannot say where the 7th species is located. One of the other 6 we see only within Neanderthals and Denisovans. We do not see it within Homo sapien DNA. The other 5 we see in distinct spaces around the world. So everybody on this planet has Neanderthal DNA pre-colonization. All of our finds from Africa have Neanderthal DNA pre-colonization, except for 2 spaces or 2 populations. Those 2 populations or communities are the Yoruba population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa. Those 2 groups do not have Neanderthal DNA within them. They do have 3 ghost species DNAs within them. And so they have 3 distinct different species in their DNA. And then we see that indigenous Australians have a distinct ghost species within their DNA, and indigenous Turtle Islanders and indigenous Aboriginals have a distinct ghost species within our DNA. So that is 5 different ghost species within people across the planet. Again, 3 within the Yoruba and the Kwe, 1 within indigenous Australians, and 1 within indigenous Turtle Islanders and Aboriginals. Again, Turtle Island is North America and Aboriginal is South America. So these ghost species that we see within our DNA are evidences of Homo erectus making it across the globe. In all of these places, we also have sites of other species that we don't actually have fossils from the species. Like here in Turtle Island, we have the Heotloka site. and we have the Cerruti Macedon site. Both of these predate 100,000 years ago. So both of these would be descendants of Homo erectus having made it here to Turtle Island. Both of these are in Turtle Island because they are both in North America. One is in Mexico and one is in California. And so we do have evidence that the Homo erectus species comes to Turtle Island and speciates here in Turtle Island. And because we have that ghost species in Turtle Island indigenous DNA and in Abayalian indigenous DNA, it also shows evidence that that species was still here when Homo erectus gets, or Homo sapien gets here, and that we intermix with that species here. We have a site called the Moy Hill site in Australia, which is 120,000 years old, which is evidence of Homo erectus making it to Australia. And then, of course, the ghost species that we see in indigenous Australians correlates with the Moy Hill site. So this tells us that we are living alongside 14 other species. That as we come to our speciation through the convergence of roughly 14 species, right? We also are living alongside so many other species. And as we're living alongside these other species, it's really important for us to understand that we are not actually looking at these other species of humans as being something to hate very early on, right? Our idea that other people are something to hate comes down 10,000 years ago, and it's really about keeping control over you when we start to get a stratified society, and people in the higher echelons of that stratified society want to make sure that they keep control of you, and so they teach you to hate other people instead of hating them as they're trying to kill you off. So we really come out of this convergence of many different species, and we have really lived most of our lives with many other species. We really have this thing where we see something new and we fuck it. Every single time we see something new and unusual, we have sex with it. We like to have children with something that looks new and unusual. We like to interact with something that looks new and unusual. This is because when we meet up with something new and unusual, we get new knowledge, right? We get new genetics, we get new things, and all of those new things are actually extremely beneficial to our species as a whole. Not only is the knowledge extremely beneficial to our species as a whole, but we've shown that the genetics are beneficial. We know now that Tibetans have their high altitude oxygen capability because of the fact that they have Denisovan DNA. They get that in genes from Denisovan, right? So we know that we're getting beneficial genes from species that are speciating in these areas. And the beneficial genes that we're getting help us adapt to these areas, help us become better within these areas quicker. And because of that, we can see that it is, again, that convergence of many, that interaction that is the healthy part, that actually creates and does better for us instead of actually being something negative, right? Now, we talked a little bit about race and the theory of race. What we didn't talk about yet is how the theory of race is really developed and how the theory of race is debunked. And I always like to talk about this because this is one of these important topics, right? So the theory of race really starts kind of coming into being in the early 1400s, though it's really not stamped down. It's more about your different city that you're living in instead of your different skin color, right? When we get to Turtle Island, when we get to the Europeans actually invading Turtle Island, we start to see this theory of race coming down to a skin color thing. And we start to see the theory of race coming down to a skin color thing based on biblical thought process. Ham is the son of Noah that sees Noah's nakedness, and therefore he is cursed for seeing Noah's nakedness. And when he is cursed from seeing Noah's nakedness, it is thought that that curse is to have darker skin. This is the biblical justification of the slave trade. This is the biblical justification of the genocide of the Turtle Island indigenous people, right? So, of course, othering is 10,000 years old. Othering, othering, making something else other, and therefore something that you can harm, goes back 10,000 years ago, and it starts with stratified society, right? It starts again to maintain control. The theory of race as an othering thought process is one of our later otherings, right? Our first otherings are the barbarians in the hills, and then it becomes different city states when everybody's in cities, and then it becomes different genders when we start othering within our own society, and then it becomes different religions, and then it becomes race. So othering based on race gets justified by the Bible. And when othering based on race can no longer be justified by the Bible because of the fact that the Bible is being shown to not be the actual truth, it's not factual, it's not scientific, they have to create the theory of race. They use, again, Neanderthal, they use skin color, they try within everything that they can to decide which races are more advanced and which races are less advanced. Not many of these tools are actually scientific tools. The closest scientific tool that they're using is calipers to measure the size of nose or the size of ears. When we now know that, you can be anywhere on this planet and your nose size and your ear size and your lip size is not, everybody has those different sizes, right? The other thing that they use is they'll take like pieces of paper and paint different shades on them and hold those different shades up next to you and decide whether or not you're the right shade, right? The pencil test where they put a pencil in your hair, and if it falls out, then you're white. And if it doesn't fall out, then you're not, right? So they have all of these really non-scientific ways that they create the theory of race. This is a justification for atrocity, because if they face the fact that everybody is of equal humanity, then they have to face the fact that they've been killing humans, right? They've been killing people who have equal humanity, right? And they can't face the fact that they are doing harm to people who have equal humanity, and they want to keep slavery in check and keep slavery happening, right? And so they start this theory of race. And in this adoption of the theory of race and in these use of non-scientific tools to create the theory of race, this kind of becomes something that, well, many governments are already founded on it based on the biblical sense. And it becomes really doubled down within things. The theory of eugenics really is a double down of the theory of race. And it states that the size of your forehead tells whether or not you're going to be a criminal, right? It has a lot of really weird shit within it. When we get to the ability to sequence DNA and then the ability to sequence ancient DNA, we start to discover within science that race does not exist. So the whole genome project is something that comes about in the early 2000s. And when they start working with the whole genome project actually shows us that there is more genetic difference within a primary population than there are between primary populations. So what do I mean by that? We have about 25,000 genes that are Homo sapien genes that are unique to Homo sapiens. And out of these 25,000 genes, you might get like 10,000 of these genes, right? So you and your next door neighbor in a primary population that has been there for 1,000 years, 10,000 years, are going to have more genetic differences. You might have genes 1 through 10,000, and they might have genes 10,000 through 20,000 than either of you are going to have from somebody in an entirely different population. So if you in South Africa have genes 1 through 10,000, there's somebody in Sweden who also has genes 1 through 10,000. So we can see that race does not exist because there is more genetic difference within population, more genetic capability of being different within primary populations than there are between primary populations. The other thing that we find with the whole genomes project is that all of the genes that are attributed to Homo sapiens can be found within the Quay population. The Quay population is considered to be our oldest population of Homo sapien. And all of the genes, all of those 25,000 genes can be found within the Quay population. So race is a colonial construct and does not in fact exist. It is something that has been used to justify atrocity, to create problems. Roughly 10,000 years ago, we see the rise of violence. Now, what do I mean by this? For the time period before that, we have roughly 2,000 skeletons, roughly 2,000 individuals that we have found in the fossil record. And of those roughly 2,000 individuals we have found in the fossil record, 2% have injuries that can be attributed to violence. Possibly. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if I see an individual whose skull has been caved in by a rock, I cannot tell you whether or not that skull has been caved in by a rock held by somebody else's hand, or whether or not that rock fell from the top of a cave and caved in their skull. At 10,000 years ago, we see violence in the archaeological record become definitive, and we see that it rises from 2% to 18 to 20%. One of the first evidences of definitive violence that we have in the archaeological record is in Kenya, of a massacre of 8 individuals lined up. One of them is a pregnant woman. Her hands are bound underneath her belly, and they're all hit from behind. in a line out in the middle of nowhere, right? So this is definitive violence. This is violence that can't be attributed as anything else but violence. We see that this rise of violence comes alongside the rise of ownership of land instead of belonging to land. The idea that the land belongs to you, it's no longer its own living, breathing entity, and it's no longer something that you belong to and you're supposed to take care of. We also see at this time that agricultural based cities, monocrop agricultural based cities start, and we see the rise of stratification within society, the rise of the idea that I need to maintain control over you. And this idea that I need to maintain control over you, that society can be stratified, that there should be somebody ruling and everybody else should be bowing down, we start to see what we call othering. Othering is the idea that you should hate your neighbor instead of hate me. As I'm stealing from you, don't fear me, fear your neighbor, because really they're the ones stealing from you. We see it again start with the barbarians in the hills, move to different nationalities, move to different gender, move to different religion, move to race. Currently, we use all of those things for othering, and then we also use immigration and houselessness, right? If you're houseless, then there must be something wrong with you and you're the one trying to take from me. If you're an immigrant, there must be something wrong with you and you're the one trying to take from me. These are all things that are being used to maintain control. These are all things that if I can convince you that it's not me that's doing you the harm, then I maintain control over you and I can hoard your gold. I can take from you. I can exploit from you. And so with that rise of othering and that rise of stratification, we also see that rise of violence. Up until this time, there's really no evidence of a lot of violence. We see that we're intermixing with these other species in a loving way, like we're incorporating people into our communities or we're being incorporated into communities. There is not this thought process that we have to kill these other species. Again, we come through our time, or we come to us as a species as a whole from convergence, from having many other species. We meet other species and they become a part of us. There is not this thought process that other species are different, right? We all look human. We're all humans up until this time. I am not functioning at my highest and I'm feeling like I need to get off and I'm getting kind of anxious. So I am going to end here. But before I end, I'm going to turn it on for questions for a couple of minutes. And then I have something I like to state at the end of all of my lives. And so I'm going to go ahead and state that as well. But let me turn it on for questions so that people can ask any questions they need to before I get out of here. I'll probably be back tomorrow or the next day, but my body is telling me that I really need to go and do other things right now. And so we're going to do that. Hey, DeCray. So when we are looking at ourselves as a species, we know that our species is biologically nurturing and communal. In the biological sense, we know we have something called mandatory midwifery. And this is because of the way that our head is shaped compared to the way that our shoulders is shaped. It's kind of like this T. And then the pelvic outlet to give birth through is shaped like this. So we have to turn our children twice to give birth to them. And we have to have assistance to do that. We can't do that on our own. And so because we have to have assistance to do that, we know that we have to have community. We know that we have to have community. And because we know that we have to have community, we know that we are a communal species. We have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. It's all over on YouTube if you've missed it. We have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Those 5 life stages currently take 25 years. Those 5 life stages are the most extended of any species. Whales are about 10 years from neonate to adult. Bonobos and orangutans are between 8 and 9 years from neonate to adult. Elephants are 5 years from neonate to adult. To get us from neonate to adult, everybody has to be involved in nurturing these children. It doesn't take 2 parents, it takes a village. You must have multiple people to raise a child from neonate to adult. And you mean, why did you want to go to a brown nation and kill people? That's what you mean, John. Because you thought you were so great, you went to a brown nation and murdered 100 million people. That's what you mean. Nobody's trying to immigrate to your white ass nation. The United States was never a white ass nation. It's a brown nation that you decided to attack. Okay. So Nobody trying to go to your white ass nation. Nobody think you got nothing going on. And you decided to go to every single other place on this planet and kill people. So why do you not understand that you're not the superiority complex when you decide to go out and kill everybody else around you and have to go to other nations that are all brown nations and take their space, their land, their knowledge? Take your racism out of my chat. Do it elsewhere, somewhere else. Okay. So we had studies that we did in the 50s and the 60s that showed what we call failure to thrive. Put orphan infants in two separate rooms, and the orphan infants in two separate rooms, one they gave love to and one that they didn't, right? Not Asiatic natives. We're Turtle Island indigenous. There's no Asiatic in us. We're not Asian descendants. We moved through Asia before people were in Asia. Before the Asians who are in Asia were there, we moved through Asia. And the people that were found by the Europeans when they invaded were phenotypically Native American. They were copper skinned with coarse, straight hair. So we know that we must nurture our children from neonate to adult to create the ability of development. Otherwise, children die. It's called failure to thrive. Because of this, we know that as a species, we are nurturing and we are communal as a species, biologically, innately. Currently, we live in a society that teaches you to be nurturing and communal is wrong, that teaches you shouldn't be taking care of others, that teaches you that it's only two parents raising a child instead of a community. And because we live in a society that is teaching us to be the antithesis of the things that we biologically need to be, many of us are depressed. Many of us are anxious. Many of us are dealing with feeling like they don't belong. Why can't I fit in? What is wrong with me that I can't make this work in my head? Um, I kind of did a little bit. Um, I can talk briefly on, how the idea that white is a category on its own instead of understanding that, white isn't even a specific culture, right? Though white has become a culture of plasticity and exploitation. Um, People who are light of skin come from multiple different cultures, right? And the idea that all those different cultures can be lumped into one thing is kind of weird. The idea that any cultures can be lumped into one racial category is kind of weird, right? Um, all of that really, though, is created for the ability to create a superiority complex, right? To confirm superiority and to ensure that you're not taking accountability for atrocities, right? So whiteness as a creation, as a racial construct, is really created as an ability to feel superior and to actually give the idea that you didn't commit atrocity, right? And the idea that all culture that is of people of lighter skin is all related is really weird, right? But so we're all living in a time and a space where society is teaching us to be the antithesis of who we are, to be something other than what we really are, and teaching you that to be what you are is wrong. So many of us are dealing with depression and anxiety because of the fact that we're living in a culture and a time that is unhealthy. This is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. If you are feeling depression or anxiety or like you don't belong, these are healthy responses to an unhealthy society. And so, what I'm going to ask of you today is to give yourself grace. You're not the problem. You're, in fact, more awake than the people around you. And because you're more awake than the people around you, you're a part of the solution. Everybody is worthy just by breathing. Everybody is necessary to humanity just by being alive, just by breathing, right? And because everybody is worthy and everybody is necessary just by breathing, you need to give yourself the love that you are worthy of. Unfortunately, many of us are willing to give love and grace to everybody else around us, but are unwilling to give love and grace to ourselves. I don't vote, I burn it to the ground. Right and left wing are on the same fucking bird. Stratified society is killing you. And if you believe that voting for one versus the other is going to save your ass, you're blind. Just saying, burn it to the fucking ground. So when we are dealing with these feelings of depression and anxiety and anxiousness, these things are very much related to being healthy in an unhealthy society. We are having healthy responses to an unhealthy society. Very likely you give grace to everybody else but yourself. And so I'm asking you today to give yourself grace and love because you are worthy of grace and love. Everybody by breathing is worthy. Everybody by breathing is worthy of existence. You do not need to be exploitable by somebody else to be worthy. You don't need to be exploited to be worthy. Your worth is not in a made up dollar sign. Your worth is by breathing. And you are worthy of love. You're worthy of acceptance. No, I don't have people I don't know in my boxes. Sorry. Nobody should invite people they don't know into their box. It's not that healthy. You might get weird diseases if you invite people you don't know into your box. Um, Ghost species are species that we see a fingerprint of them in our DNA, like we do Neanderthal and Denisovan, but we haven't found them in their whole genome in the fossil record yet. So they're a ghost. We don't know who they are yet. I have to go. My brain is not working. Much love to everybody. Take care. Remember that you are worthy just by breathing. You do not need to be worthy by somebody else's standards. Give yourself grace and love today. You deserve it. You are worthy of it. And take care of yourself. I will probably be back tomorrow. I just need to not today. Much love to everybody. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Take care, YouTube. I'm so sorry I have to leave so early, but my body is just not working. Have a great day, everybody.